Wawitzpole, Louis Quest, Dushnaiga, Puswawa, Kaba Msaiga, Alda, Naiga Mashlait, Kaba Alsi Alii, Naiga Chagu, Kaba Lagawa, P Talawadini, P Takelma Ilii, Naiga Meshait, P Chilamesh, Kaba Wadaraka Ilii. Hello, good morning, I'm Dr. Bird. I am currently on Alsi land, Alsi Band of Chinook land. I was born on Takelma and Lagawa and Talawadini land in the Applegate Valley of Oregon. And I currently live and work on Wadaraka Paiute land out in Harney County, Oregon. I am a non-citizen Spokane person. I'm also from the Munro clan of Scotland and the Moore sept of Scotland on my mother and father's sides respectively, and I am from several small Irish septs on my mother and father's side also. Today I am with my wife, who's operating the camera.
Hello.
And my ancient and eternal Freya, who has lived with me for over 14 years now. So the idea of becoming birds, from an academic perspective, or maybe in the context of my dissertation, really was addressing the fact that, so I interviewed a bunch of birders and tried to understand what birders were learning from birds about ecology. And so I did this in a couple of different ways, and one of the cool things that came out of this project is that birders, that when they described an ecosystem through the lens of what birds need, so they're really paying attention to what birds need and want and benefit from in an ecosystem, that those individuals actually seem to understand a lot about the ecology of the places that they were birding in. And that could be something that's a very small, family-owned or family-managed piece of land that they understand the history of that place since they started living there. But really, everybody that described place through the lens of birds had a really intimate ecological understanding of that place. So the idea of becoming birds in this more academic context is if you take on the perspective of a bird, you are becoming a bird and learning something about that place. But for me personally, it has to do with the fact that so when I was very young and I first started talking, all I talked about was birds, and I've had a really intense lifelong connection to birds. And in high school, I spent all of my summer, every weekend and all summer, working at a wildlife rehabilitation center. And so I was working around and with birds all day. And for my high school scholarship essay, for the community scholarship fund, I wrote an essay, and you had to write about what you wanted to be when you grew up. And I wrote an entire essay about how all I wanted was to be a bird and why I wanted to be a bird. And it's funny because at the time, everybody acted like that was really ridiculous. And for me, it just made sense. And I realized at some point that doesn't have to mean like you grow feathers, and start eating fish or something. For me, it could be just, taking on for like on a personal level, it's really become taking on this reciprocal relationship where you're learning from birds and caring for birds. And like, I don't know, I just at some point realized that I met that goal I had as a teenager. Most people call me Bird, and so that's, you know, kind of a funnier take on it. But so growing up as somebody that really, I mean, for no reason that anybody can understand, had this really strong attachment to birds. And, you know, like I talked about birds so much that my mom bought bird feeders, and then I demanded to know who the birds in the feeders were, and then she had to start trying to help me learn how to learn these birds and learn who they are. But I never was a birder. Like, I didn't go out birding because I didn't know people that birded until I was very solidly an adult. And the first time I went out as a teenager on a birding trip, I was chastised by an adult man birder who thought it was ridiculous that I could say that I like birds if I couldn't identify a yellow warbler. And I was like 16 or 17, self-taught. The only birds I knew were the birds that I interacted with. And it really discouraged me from birding. And for a long time, I was like, well, I'm a person that likes birds, but I can't be a birder if I'm not keeping a life list, and I'm not trying to do a big year, and I'm not trying to, name every bird and do that really onery, conquery thing that happens with birding sometimes. And it took me a while to realize that you can be a birder and not keep a list and not care if you can name every bird or whatever. I don't know, it feels like trophy hunting, that thing that happens in birding sometimes. It doesn't have to be birding. A big year doesn't have to mean traveling all over and seeing one bird for a second. A big year can be just seeing how many song sparrows you see in a year. And so I think that that's one of the weird things about being an indigenous birder is realizing how often people are not interested in actually knowing what birds are in the place that they're in. So if all you're doing is keeping a list of birds you see in a year, you're potentially not stopping and taking the time to acknowledge those individual birds as individuals. And you're not taking the time to acknowledge what they might be trying to teach you about the place that you're in and what might be happening in that place. And, I think it removes the concept that, every robin is an individual living its life, and it might have its own personality quirks, and it might, do something funny that other robins don't do. And if all you say is, well, I got my robin for the year, I don't need to think about these others anymore, it makes it easier to dismiss the damage that happens to birds. It makes it easier to dismiss habitat loss and anti-conservation rhetoric, because those individual birds don't matter, because I can still go see the one robin I need for the year on my list. And I think that that's where the colonial part of birding becomes so problematic. It makes it really easy for people to say, I got my picture, I got my list, I don't need to worry about helping protect birds in the places they're in, or I don't need to worry about what lessons I could be learning from these individual beings out here. Audubon, John James Audubon was pretty racist, and we herald him as this conservationist, but John James Audubon knew ivory-billed woodpecker were going extinct and wanted one, for his collection or to paint or whatever, and still went out and was willing to shoot an ivory-billed woodpecker. And so these like fathers of conservation who came up in an era where what people did was shoot birds to stuff and put in museums, and in Audubon's case, to pose into different shapes and paint. The excuse we make for them is, well, that was just what was happening at that time. But there were plenty of people doing conservation and living in community with these birds for a long time who didn't need to shoot them and stuff them and put them in museums. And so even these like modern birder conservation groups, like Audubon societies, I mean, they're named for a guy who didn't really respect individual birds. He maybe respected species, but individual birds didn't really matter to him. And I think a lot of our birding groups today stemmed from that, idea of like finding and shooting and collecting. And yes, the listing became paper and not death, but in the quest for those birds on paper, people sometimes still harm those birds. It's a really great example out of Chicago. This was probably a decade ago now, but burrowing owl showed up there. That's a super weird place for a burrowing owl, and a bunch of birders that wanted to see it had gone into hiding, and rather than just accepting that like that bird is hiding and it doesn't want to be seen, they formed a line through the grass and all walked through the grass to flush it, and they flushed it, and a hawk swooped down and killed it. And so it turns out the burrowing owl was hiding from a predator. But these people who wanted to see it and add it to their list decided their need to see that bird was more important than its comfort and whatever it was trying to tell them about its own safety by hiding. And so that to me is like the epitome of like, birding mostly comes from this Western colonial, all that matters is my list and me place. And with the pandemic, we got birding organizations in general have been really excited that there are so many new birders, and Cornell Lab of Ornithology is working on with like tech developers to develop new technology that helps people identify birds so that they may never have to talk to another birder. They may never have to work with another person. They can just use this technology to identify birds. And on the one hand, I think, well, that's great because it's trying to help people connect to birds. But what I have noticed is that in the last year, all the new birders and photographers are coming from this place of consumption and this Western idea that what I want and what I see and what I need is all that matters. It doesn't matter if I'm taking a picture of this bird nest and showing ravens where they are because I got to see the nest and get a picture of these eggs. And so that like, it's like putting your own glory on yourself or something for finding that nest, even if the nest failed because you directed predators to it. And it's just not increasing the number of birders who think from that Western colonial perspective and aren't interested in learning from birds and aren't interested in the reciprocal relationship with birds. That's not going to help anybody or anything. Nests have been the big one this year. It's for all the chastising I do of Western science, there have been some great sociological studies that have come out about how social media destroys nature. And so one of the things that I've noticed with just in the last year with the increase in photographers and birders that are new is that if one person, say, finds a green heron nest, green heron chicks are so cute and they look like little fluffy dinosaurs. And if one person finds a green heron nest and they say, oh, I just found this green heron nest in this place and I got this picture, then pretty soon you have 15 photographers that are going there every day every day looking at the same nest in the same place. And, you know, predators are smart. And as I mentioned before, like ravens will watch people's behavior to find out what people are doing. Ravens are super smart, and they have a really long-term relationship, you know, since time immemorial with people. And so ravens are like, oh, we're pros too. Like, why are these people all coming out and standing in this spot and staring at that thing for so long every day? I'm going to go check it out. And then they might find the nest and meal for them. Unfortunately for green herons. And so, you know, one of the things that's happened a lot this year is with these people wanting to post egg pictures and baby bird pictures, people are also getting really close. So people that can't afford a zoom lens, so this is like a classism issue a little bit too. People who can't afford a zoom lens are going to walk up really, really close to that nest because they want the same picture everybody else has been getting. And when you try to have a conversation about how close they are to the nest, people will say, well, I'm far enough away because I am comfortable with where I am. But, you know, birds as individuals often have different comfort levels. So as a species, the smaller the bird, typically the less distance they prefer from their nest. So, you know, a sparrow or a hummingbird are probably going to have a smaller territory around their nest or a smaller area of discomfort around their nest than, say, a ferruginous hawk or a bald eagle. So the bigger the birds are, the farther that distance you need to stay away from the nest is. And that varies a ton within individuals. There's a ferruginous hawk nest out in Kearney County that every time I see that nest, it surprises me that the birds continue nesting there. It seems so close to the road, and so many birders stop and take pictures of it. And those ferruginous hawks seem to be comfortable with what they have established. But in general, ferruginous hawks, if they're in the incubating stage and you're up, you know, 200 meters or 100 meters from their nest, they're acting a little bit uncomfortable. And so it's not, so I guess the thing that I've been noticing is that people assume either A, they meet an individual of a species that is like, I'm comfortable with people, and they assume all individuals in that species are comfortable with people. Great horned owls are another really good example. At Malheur, there's a pair that nests at hecklers every year. And I mean, people walk right under that nest. And those owls, they don't care. Their chicks don't seem annoyed. The adults don't seem annoyed. They all just seem to have accepted that they live with people. But, you know, in Salem, I remember how many years ago it was now, there was the great horned owls nesting in the park that didn't want anybody near their nest. I don't even know how close people were getting to their nest, but the owls were attacking people that were running through the park because they didn't want people near their nest. And so, you know, this thing that photographers, non-indigenous or more colonially minded photographers and birders do is they say this one bird represents the entire species. Which is a little bit what we do with BIPOC and other marginalized people, right? We say this one person and their opinion represents everybody in that group. That's not true. And I think for the most part, we all know that's not true. And the same thing applies with birds. But people, you know, put their own concept of what too close is on them, and they put their own concept of, like, animals don't have free will or sovereignty or opinions about anything on them. And really all that does is end up hurting the birds or other wildlife. A lot of the anti-invasive species rhetoric, I mean, especially in birding circles, it reaches a level of disdain that to me feels really similar to like anti-native rhetoric or anti-black rhetoric. Like that level of like anger at these species for existing sometimes feels really similar to like the anti-BIPOC and anti-LGBTQ and anti-disabled people rhetoric in this country. You know, within indigenous communities, there's pretty mixed opinions about non-native species. I know some natives that are like, when they see European starlings or European house sparrows, they feel like that's just a constant reminder of colonization or like continued colonization, because of the competition these species have with native species for housing. I also know native people, and this extends to like not just birds, but this extends into plants and things like that. I know native people that think that it's our responsibility to learn what we can from those species and learn how to live with them, because they also have lessons to teach us. And you know, that has become my stance on them. I mean, I've always really loved starlings. There's something really magical about a bird that looks like the night sky for part of the year, in that it's starry and then looks like maybe a different kind of night sky during the year when they're not starry. Like, I think that starlings are kind of magical, and maybe that's my Irish roots. Maybe my connection to starlings has to do with all my Irish and Scottish ancestors. But you know, and I've done a lot of work with birds, and I have not noticed that starlings are actually displacing native cavity nesting birds in the places that I've done research. A lot of the places starlings were in were places that had, you know, hundreds of cavities and 2 or 3 starling nests in them and a bunch of other native cavity nesters. I think sometimes they get a bad name because they will go in and take over a nest of native birds, but lots of native birds do that to each other. If you are nesting in a prime cavity, I mean, any species might kick you out. That's a fact that I think people don't really understand about, you know, birds interacting for nesting space. And so they blame starlings and they blame house sparrows for a behavior that our native birds also have. And so it feels a little inappropriate to blame them. And also, it's not their fault they're here. They were brought here by a bunch of people who decided they should live here. It's not their fault that they're here and living here and successful here. And, you know, for starlings, their populations are declining in Europe. And last time I read, nobody was really sure why. And so, I don't know. I just think it's a weird thing. And I think that, you know, people in Europe really love starlings and they're native there. And so it just seems like a weird thing to hate a species so much for something that's not its fault. Learning to live with them and learning what lessons we can from them and appreciating them as their own little sovereign beings is, for me, very important. But I also think it's really important to recognize the native people who feel like these species just represent colonization for them because they are from Europe. They were brought here by colonizers. And so finding that balance between recognizing the colonization that they represent and the displacement that they represent, while also being able to understand that they are individual beings with things to teach us and relationships to have and opinions and whatnot of their own. That is also an important thing for me to remember. So identity is a funny thing, and I think that, you know, I talk about birds and their own identities as individuals and their sovereignty and whatnot, and then I also think I often feel like the way we talk about identity in society is really shaped by the importance of these like weird, rigid boxes and hierarchies that are part of colonization. And so the thing that I feel like birds and nature have really been able, the way that birds and nature have shaped me a little bit, I mean, there's a lot of ways they've shaped me, but in terms of identity is like, I have a pretty fluid understanding of myself just as a being in general, as a person in this world. And part of that comes from this understanding that, like, you know, colonization tells us that, you know, men are bigger than women. And so people are like, oh, male bald eagles are obviously bigger than female bald eagles. And that's not true. In the bird world, in the raptor world, for pretty much anything bigger than a kestrel, females are bigger than males. And so their plumage is mostly the same, except for kestrels. But the females are bigger. And the same with phalaropes. So, like, in the bird world, we're taught, you know, birds are monogamous. No, they're not. There's not a single I can think of one bird species in Oregon that is actually monogamous, and that's the wrentit, and they're queer little birds. So, like, most birds participate in extra pair matings. It increases genetic diversity in the flock. It sometimes is a way of strengthening your bond with your mate, which is like a funny concept. But we also are always taught that if there's a bird that has more than one mate, they're all polygynous. They all have multiple one male, multiple female partners. But phalaropes aren't that way. Females are big, they're colorful, they're like super pretty. They fight each other for males. And then they lay their eggs in a male's nest and walk away. So they're polyandrous, lots and lots of male mates. They put their babies everywhere, and the males raise them. Ostriches. Is it ostriches and emus? Both? I'm trying to remember. When they nest, they sometimes will build a nest, and then lots of females come lay their eggs in that one male's nest. And so that one male will just have a nest that's composed of, like, a bunch of different females' eggs that he incubates and raises and takes care of. And so, like, one of the cool things that I think nature has to teach us, and birds specifically can teach us, is that all these constructs and boxes that colonization has created for us are actually not real, because nature doesn't actually replicate any of that. The thing that birds, we say, oh, males are colorful, females are plain, and have all these, like, things. They're like, males develop a cloacal protuberance when they're gonna nest, and females pluck all their breast feathers and create this, it's like, it almost looks like a blister. So there'll be no feathers on it, and it fills with fluid, and that fluid helps to actually expand the amount of heat that is being passed to the eggs. So it's like an incubation blister that they create intentionally, which maybe says a lot about how we should be caring for our young. So when you have a bird in hand and you're banding them, there are things that you look for that are like, oh, that makes this one a male and that makes this one a female. And wrentits, they're not different by plumage. You cannot tell a wrentit, a male from a female, in the field. And you also can't tell them apart in hand. So for some birds where their plumage is the same, once you get them in hand, if they've got a brood patch, they're female, and if they've got a cloacal protuberance, which is just a swollen cloaca, they're a male. And what wrentits, males and females get a cloacal protuberance, and I don't know why. I mean, I have some ideas from a real, like, non-colonial, genderqueer perspective as to why, but also they both develop brood patches. And so with wrentits, you can't tell if it's a male or a female. They both sing. I may be wrong there, I should check that. Anyway, they, in hand, in the field, you can't tell males and females apart. They're super tightly bonded. They're constantly chattering to each other when they're in the bush, trying to understand how far away, they are from each other. Their young don't disperse very far from the nest, and they are hyper-monogamous species. They, to our knowledge, they don't participate in extra pair copulations. And so, like, wrentits are these just, like, super genderqueer, like, we're going to show you that what you think about the biological world is just not always true. Little creatures and little beings. And it's one of my very favorite things about them. And I feel like when I was 20, when I learned this about wren tits, I was down in Southern California meeting all kinds of new birds, and learned this about wren tits because we needed to know that we're banning them. And it just forever since then really made me think about like what does gender actually mean, and how do we define gender and gender roles. And I don't know, for me, wren tits were the individuals in the world that first told me that you don't have to fit into these colonized boxes of what gender and like relationship to the world are. So Malheur National Wildlife Refuge is a pretty important place to a lot of birders in Oregon. A lot of people have a lot of birders have a pretty strong tie to Malheur. And one of the things that makes Malheur such a great place for birding is that there are all of these homestead and civilian conservation corps era trees at Malheur, and lots of different pockets of Malheur. And those trees and all of the altered hydrology of the refuge because of grazing and colonization and whatnot, it creates all these kind of oases that existed since time immemorial, but in a very different form. Those areas of water and big tall trees out in these seas of sagebrush are really attractive to birds that have been blown off course. It's like rare warblers and things like that. And so it's really interesting. It's really interesting if you think about it from that perspective as like a birder and an indigenous person. Like, oh, I got to see my first magnolia warbler. They are so pretty. At headquarters in a cottonwood. And so like a tree that doesn't belong there at a place that is beloved, but also a pretty, like, that is a sign of colonization and settlement, these homestead era trees and CCC era tree or buildings and whatnot. And I'm also standing like not very far from a really important like site to the Burns Pike. Like simultaneously, I could be seeing this rare bird who probably would not have shown up there if it wasn't for these trees that only exist there because of the creation of the refuge and because of settlement and exist on native lands. And I mean, that's true for refuges across the country. Refuges are often in wetlands. Wetlands were often very important to Native people, tribes across the Americas. Areas where waterfowl meet and nest are great sources of protein, eggs and birds, and for tule and cattail and bulrush for making tule ducks and mats. And depending on where you live, your house was made out of, potentially made out of tule and bulrush. And, you might make hats or clothing out of it. And so like these wetlands were super important. And these wetlands are also which were important for birds, so now they're national wildlife refuges. And so these places exist kind of at the nexus of, maybe at the nexus of like birding and conservation and colonization and settler mindset and native land. And I think it's important that we all recognize that. There's often talk about giving, say, Malheur Lake back to the Paiute, and I think Malheur Lake has been trashed by the way that the hydrology is managed out there now. Like, giving back something that is so altered from what it was, is that doing something generous? maybe it's the right thing to do to give that land back, but then we also have got to be able to like support the conservation, like the restoration of the lake to what it used to be still. When we're out birding, everybody, when they're out birding or hiking or digging cockles or being a person interacting with the world in a park in your city, like it's super important to remember that you're on somebody's land. Somebody was there since time immemorial. And where did they go? I think people have gotten better about recognizing that like Malheur is Burns Paiute land, but people are bad at recognizing why the Burns Paiute aren't there anymore. The Paiute didn't say, please come develop all of our water to start agriculture systems here, and please make this National Wildlife Refuge where our treaty reservation is, and please build these buildings and plant these trees so rare birds come. We want you to do that. That's not what happened. They were forcibly removed from their land to make space for ag, and then they were sent to a reservation that was then taken from them because that could be good ag, and they were sent to another area of Harney Basin, and then they were moved from there to where they are today. The reservation is just north of Burns. And it's really important that we not just recognize whose land we're on. I am on Alsea land now. Where are the Alsea today? And why aren't they here? Well, they're not here because somebody wanted to be able to build this bridge in that town and this campground and fish all the salmon out of the river. And so the Alsea were removed from here and sent to become part of an entirely different federally recognized tribe. And it happened everywhere across the country. In Oregon, we have lots and lots of bands of Chinook. Those Chinook are not all part of one recognized tribe. They've been split between tribes, just like the Paiute. Different bands of Paiute were sent to live with different people who spoke a different language. And, it happened all over North America. And so it's not enough to just say, whose land are you on? You've got to learn why they're not there anymore, or at least recognize why they're not there anymore. Maybe you don't know the full history of, where they were moved from place to place and what treaties were signed, and maybe someday you will know that. But today, you need to know whose land you're on and where they are now, why they're there. I think that there's been a misuse of the word decolonize. It became kind of trendy, and everybody's thinking that they're decolonizing when they're actually not. And so one of the things that Native communities or peoples have started saying is settlers need to unsettle and indigenous people need to decolonize, because when settlers start to control the narrative about decolonization, then actually what happens is that they just perpetuate colonization. So I think birders on some level actually need to understand that Western worldviews are a worldview. Western science. I had an conversation with a Western scientist one time, and this was about Mauna Kea, and he was saying we shouldn't be stopping scientific progress for a mythology. And he was talking about Native Hawaiians and their culture and their beliefs and their worldviews. And I said to him, well, science is just your mythology. And he did not like that because our colonized society and education system tells us that actually Western science is the only way to know anything. And what Western scientists say is always true. And so really, to me, the very first place people have to start is in understanding that is a lie we've been told. Native people did science. They did native science since time immemorial. and Western scientists came in and told them they didn't know anything about salmon, they didn't know anything about huckleberries and what they needed. That, you know, huckleberries are a great example. Western scientists were like, fire is bad for huckleberries. Native people, anywhere where huckleberries grow, no, that's not true. Huckleberries need fire to keep the conifers from shading them and the nutrients from the soil to help them grow. Like, huckleberries have a reciprocal relationship with fire. And Western science tried to be like, no, that's not true. And so now there's lots and lots of huckleberry fields that are like traditional berry picking fields that are all overgrown and aren't producing a lot of berries because Native people aren't managing them. And I shouldn't even say managing. Native people aren't being allowed to have their relationship with that place anymore. And, you know, so that might have been a little off track, but I really feel like that's the root. And so, like, with my dissertation, that's part of what I was trying to do, is to show that only measuring people based, like, only trying to understand what people know about ecology from this Western perspective, you know, giving somebody a multiple choice, you know, questionnaire and saying only these concepts that Western science thinks are important are what you need to know. And you only need to know it through the Western schooling and through the scientific method and whatnot. Like, I try to say, I think there's a different way we need to be talking about what we know about ecosystems. And I think we need to work harder at understanding that actively learning from the land, letting the land teach us things, letting birds teach us things, that is just as valid as a way to learn as Western science is. I do want to add a caveat that doesn't mean that all local knowledge is the most important knowledge. A local, you know, a fifth generation farmer probably knows a lot about that land that they settled and are farming. And they probably know a lot about the relationship between water and the plants they're growing. It does not mean that they know a lot about the ecology and conservation of the place they're in, except for through that Western lens of must develop, must use, nature's only here to be whatever, conquered. And so I think sometimes we say to people, start accepting local knowledge, start accepting things that aren't Western science, and then what ends up happening is we just lift up more voices that are still colonial and Western voices. And so I think, like, birders need to be careful that that's not what we replace Western science with. We can't just say, well, you know, Western science isn't the only way to know anything, and so now we should uplift a bunch of other white people and what they know about the place. I should add that I introduced myself in a mix of Spokane and Chinagwawa because, so I, as a non-citizen Spokane person, I'm not an enrolled member of the tribe. My great-grandpa was the last person that was part of the tribe. He was taken to Chemawa Indian School, which is a boarding school near Salem. But back when it was run as a way of disconnecting Native people from their communities. I also, at the time, Oregon had a lot of laws that said that for Native men to marry non-Native women, they had to give up their culture, but Native women didn't have to give up their culture, which I don't know what that says about the U.S. But so my great-grandpa made the decision to not pass on any language and culture that he knew before he died. And so I have been making the effort to reconnect in bits and pieces. I don't live in Eastern Washington, so that's a hard thing to do. And I connected with the language and culture program and have language learning materials, and have been teaching myself how to speak Spokane dialect of Interior Salish. I also have been learning Chinagwawa, which is the trade language of the Pacific Northwest. So a lot of tribes that traded with each other had influence over the language. And I I speak what should be described as probably a pidgin indigenous language right now, where I'm taking a pretty regular class in Chinakwawa, so I know Chinakwawa better than I know Spokane. And so when I introduce myself, I often have to speak in both languages because I don't know enough Spokane. That is not every Indigenous person's experience. I also want to make sure that people understand that, like, my perspective on how to be in relationship with the world is my perspective. Indigenous people do have a pretty similar pedagogy and a pretty similar, so it's like understanding of how to learn and teach, and also have very similar ontologies, which is like understanding of how to be in the world. But that doesn't mean that they're all the same, and that doesn't mean that every Indigenous person today has the same perspective, and we definitely don't all have the same experiences. And so I just think it's really important to highlight that my experience and perspective could be very, very different from an Indigenous birder who grew up on reserve in Canada, for example. And so anybody who's watching this, you should do what you can to find other Indigenous birders and understand their perspectives as well.